All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Drayden Kreft. I'm the program manager for the Mission Acceleration Center here in the Pacific Northwest, and this is our Business of Innovation in Defense seminar series. This is the third iteration of our series. If you caught our other ones, well, thanks for coming back, and hope to teach you some new information here today. This one is going to be focused on adversarial capital and influence, as well as compliance and regulations surrounding those topics and how to protect your product and your innovation from foreign influence and foreign capital investment to maintain opportunities with the federal government and the DoD for them to be your potential customers. So we are delighted to have Jeanne Suchodolski, Director of Innovation Protection Policy with the Office of Naval Research here today. She's going to start with her presentation about adversarial foreign investment and technology acquisition risks. Then we're going to be joined by Robert Smith, who's the director of the Navy SBIR STTR program. He's going to talk about some upcoming changes and current draft formulations of due diligence programs that are going to be added into the SBIR process to maintain protections for your company's IP and your product, as well as maintaining security for the nation and products that are coming through and being invested in by the DoD and the federal government. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with Lee Yates, who is the private sector coordinator from the FBI Seattle field office. And their group here specializes in assisting companies like yourself doing innovation and advanced technology to protect yourself from foreign investors or foreign adversaries trying to collect your intellectual property. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to pass it off quickly to Justin Dunnicliffe, who works for the Defense Innovation Unit. He's going to share a few words about their involvement and their support for the PNW MAC program. Justin?
All right, thanks, Drayden. Hi, everybody. Justin Dunnicliffe, Senior Advisor at the Defense Innovation Unit. Also helped co-found the Mission Acceleration Center here in Seattle. So really excited to be here. I think this is a great seminar series for us to be hosting. One of the biggest challenges that we've recognized through the work of all these defense innovation activities is really how do we help companies understand kind of the challenges facing them from these adversaries that we have. Understanding that there are things that you as a company need to be paying attention to from other actors around the world who may not have the best interests for you at heart. And it's really critical to our national security that we help companies understand some of these threats. And so this topic, adversarial capital influence, is a really big one. We try to talk about this a lot with a lot of companies that we come into contact with just to make sure that they understand. So I think this as a seminar for us to give you all a primer on what to be looking for and understanding about how the world works outside of our borders is really critical. And so I'm really hopeful that this provides a lot of basic and good information to help you understand how to navigate this space. DIU is a core supporter of the Mission Acceleration Center, and this is really well aligned with our mission. So I'm excited for the seminar to kick off, and Drayden, back to you.
Thank you, Justin. Just a short housekeeping note, the chat is open as well as the Q&A session. So if you have any questions that pop up along the journey of Jeanne's presentation, feel free to put them in there, and we will go ahead and have a short Q&A session at the end of each presenter and provide some answers to the questions that you guys come up with. And then we'll wrap it up at the end. Any final questions that we weren't able to touch on, then we'll finalize there. So without further ado, Jeanne, the floor is yours, and can't wait to hear what you have to say.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for attending. And yeah, I can see the slides are up there. Yeah. So as Drayden said in his kind introduction, I am the Navy's Director of Innovation Protection Policy, and I work out of the Office of Naval Research. A big part of my job is protecting the nation's industrial and economic base from adversarial manipulation, and especially our innovation ecosystem, of which you are all a part. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, we're going to start kind of at a theoretical level, and then we're going to narrow it down to things that are really tactical and might hit closer to your daily work life, and hopefully will be of use to you. And as Justin said, identifying the risks and threats and understanding the real seriousness and complexity of adversarial initiatives that are really trying to target our United States innovation and allies innovation ecosystem. So with that, let's start with some common myths that I hear out there all the time. So next slide, please. So here are some common risks I hear in the innovation ecosystem and amongst companies, and what the reality is versus those risks. So one of the commonly held beliefs is, I don't do business in China or Chinese firms, so I'm not a target of these adversarial technology appropriation practices because I don't intersect with them. And that in reality is not correct. So China as an adversary is engaged in very sophisticated strategies within the United States and within our borders to acquire our technology. It can in fact be very difficult to know the nature of firms, investors, and partners with whom you are working without doing significant due diligence. And there is active attempts for them to manipulate and obscure who they in fact are. And sometimes they come at us not directly, but through other countries. And so perhaps our FBI colleague at the end of this conversation will touch on some of these things, perhaps not. But one of the other common myths we have is that, yeah, okay, I don't do business in China, my supply chain's not in China. And what we found, at least with our DoD suppliers and constituencies, that most of them don't really have knowledge of their supply chain past their tier 1 supplier, and at most their tier 2 supplier. And they really place that risk contractually on their tier 1 supplier to know who their tier 2s are, and so on and so forth down the line, and kind of this flow down of requirements about who's a good supplier and who isn't. But in reality, that's not really different than practice in the private sector. And so people tend not to have a lot of good visibility about what their supply chain is. We've spent a significant amount of time and effort over the last 18 months to 24 months inside the DoD and really understanding this. So if the DoD is your customer, you can probably expect to have more accelerated questions about understanding your supply chain going forward for just these reasons. One of the other beliefs or myths we hear out there is that people have really good, sophisticated physical and cybersecurity plans. If that's you, awesome. That's certainly a step in mitigating in the right direction. But cyber and theft of intellectual property, as we'll discuss later, is only one means and not the exclusive means of technology appropriation. In fact, for my work and what we're going to talk about later, it's actually not the primary form by which they appropriate technology from our young innovative firms in our economy. The other myth is we hear, hey, I've got an advanced intellectual property protection and management scheme. And again, if that's you, spot on, that's exactly what you should be doing. And that, of course, is a very good mitigation practice and highly recommended. But a lot of what we see transpire is around licensing deals, mergers and acquisitions, where you don't really understand your partner and suddenly they drop the deal at the last minute and they've done all the due diligence, they've gotten all the information they want, and they walk away from the transaction. There is a definite set of playbooks that are executed from my perspective out there in the wild, and having intellectual property protection is necessary, but insufficient to stop the practices altogether. And finally, we hear this comment a lot too, or I do. I actually am not a company that's doing business in the types of technology of interest. And as we go through the presentation today, I hope I'm going to dissuade you of that, no matter what technology you happen to be working on, because the technologies of interest cover a wide swath of technologies. And the National Security Council of the United States has generated a list of critical technologies in our economy and industrial base. That's 22 technologies wide, and those descriptions are very broad. And that list of critical and emerging technologies is replicated in adversarial companies and throughout the world as critical technologies people want to dominate and appropriate and really be in control of going forward. So next slide, please. So I mentioned we were going to start at somewhat of a theoretical layer, and then we're going to come back down closer to the ground and more boots on the ground kind of practical implementations. So why are all those myths and the reality something I wanted to start this conversation with? And that there was an underlying assumption that there's an adversary that's really executing a very complex and strategic approach to our industrial base by investing in it and trying to appropriate via adversarial capital and initiatives our technology and our innovation ecosystem. Well, just briefly, if you look at how nation states resolve conflicts with each other historically and what the consequence of that are, we have our legal means and our normal means like diplomacy and talking to each other. And we have treaties, and we have treaties about how to resolve conflicts in treaties. We have third-party nation states that can get involved and resolve conflicts. And those are all peaceful and legal means by which nations can pursue their interests vis-a-vis each other and resolve their conflicts. And then on the extreme end, we get to kinetic warfare, which of course is a solution of last resort for nation states to pursue their goals and resolve conflicts, and is in fact de novo illegal under international law. But what we see is that in between those extremes is an emerging set of international competitive strategies, which are enabled by the fact that the world's societies and their economies are so interconnected in ways that weren't true before. And geographic separation is no longer as important as it was like in the medieval times when we went on crusades and invaded other countries to get what we want. We don't need to do that anymore. You can influence another country just by the fact that you're interconnected with them economically, politically, or sociologically. And that's a point of influence. And so the thing I want to leave you with, without going into a lot of theory and strategy about what's going on here, is that China, especially as a nation state, is executing a comprehensive adversarial strategy that is much more sophisticated than the mere theft of intellectual property and knowledge that we hear about in the press. They are in fact targeting our innovation ecosystem as a whole because it is a driver of our economic competitiveness, our national security, and our ability to field technologically advanced military. So they are going after constituent components of that innovation ecosystem in a very strategic and targeted way. That includes individual companies such as yourself who have interesting technologies. That also includes the infrastructure and features of that innovation ecosystem, like its finance system, how it puts capital into play, which is what we're talking about today, and other aspects of how our innovation ecosystem works. So this strategy is called, or this tactic as a competitive strategy is named innovation warfare. It is something this particular adversary is executing against us, and against which we must defend, and against which many of the companies who are audiences on this call today are a potential target or a potential participant in unknowingly or unwittingly. All right, so next slide, please. So how are they going about doing this, and what are the goals that the adversary has for innovation warfare? So their specific goals are to equate or surpass the US as a global superpower by the year 2049. So that means they want to be the predominant technological and economic engine of the world by 2049, and they want to be at least on parity with our military. They want to influence the world value system away from the post-World War II international legal system and order that has pretty much kept the peace, and they want to drive their own economy via innovation-driven growth, which by itself isn't bad. But how are they doing this? Well, as a top-down directed economy in many respects, they have state-directed plans that have specific targets. There are many documents, public documents, that define what their government is going to do, how they're going to go about it. And these plans map innovation and technology objectives to the means to acquire them. And so the point here is, there is a very systemic whole of society, whole of government approach about how they are going to succeed at these goals. And a component of that, like I said, is to target our innovation ecosystems for opportunities, both to appropriate things of interest and to potentially degrade it for their own purposes. Next slide, please. So when we think about innovation and intellectual property management, we think about activities that exist along a continuum. And as you get more and more capable, as you go up this pyramid here, you are doing more and more external influencing activities versus internal management activities. So if we look at intellectual property and innovation and technology management, at the lower levels of this pyramid, these are pretty much legal functions that manage internal cost and acquisition and management of capital and intellectual property and the product development and innovation pipelines. And when we get to the top of the pyramid, we are actually looking at extremely sophisticated behaviors that are trying to shape the larger system and influence it in a way that are advantageous to that particular owner of innovation or IP or systems. Now, this is no different than what American companies are in fact very, very good at in using IP and product development and innovation systems to remain competitive. And I'm going to explain in a minute why it's not competition as usual, however. But when we do these things, we're doing them on a firm level, whereas we have an adversary who's now doing them at a nation state level with all of the resources and apparatus and strategic organization of a nation state who's trying to fight this fight with these tools. And you're just a little company that's normally trying to go along doing business as usual. It's now not maybe a fair fight, and it may not even be a highly visible, and it's probably an opaque fight, and especially in the way it shows up at your doorstep. So next slide, please. So I said, why isn't this just normal economic competition? That pyramid's something that American businesses are really good at. In fact, American businesses define that chart. So why isn't this economic competition as normal? So you can see here a comparison. I'm not going to read this chart line by line, but just generally, the United States is a market-driven economy and it's governed by the rule of law, and it has metes and bounds that allow those market influences, allow people to compete, and everybody knows what the rules are. And it's not centrally controlled. There's no government-sponsored economic espionage of businesses overseas. Whereas the Chinese, it's not competition as usual, because it's a nation state pursuing a strategy, and it's doing that via activation of private sector actors and legal mechanisms within the economy, as well as traditional means of economic state espionage and statecraft. So it's not a market-driven economy. In fact, the Chinese government has said one of the principles it wants adopted and understood in international law is they will never be a market-driven economy to make decisions and drive innovation and et cetera. It has a practice of developing innovation not by fair competition, but also by theft, replication, and appropriation of others' technology. And it is governed by, it is ruled by law and not rule of law the way we do in the United States. So there are some significant differences. There are significant opportunities for us to cooperate with the Chinese, and I need to make very clear here that what we're talking about is the Chinese government and not the Chinese people. This is not a anti-Chinese conversation. This is talking about a nation state government who is trying to run a competitive strategy against the innovation ecosystem of the United States. And for that reason alone, it's not business as usual, even though it looks like at your doorstep, these are normal, routine business transactions and opportunities that are presenting themselves. So next slide, please. So on the left is a chart that was created by the Defense Innovation Unit back in 2018, 2019. And what they did was they looked at all the different mechanisms that the adversary is using to appropriate technology and manipulate the innovation ecosystem within the United States. And there's a line there, horizontal line, and above that line are all the illegal methodologies that are being used by the adversary to acquire technology. These include the normal things like espionage and spying and theft of trade secret and cyber hacking and all those good illegal things. However, as you note below, most of the activities are legal. And so our FBI colleague is going to talk today is probably going to talk a little bit about the scope and breadth of the illegal activities. But what I want to focus on today is the scope and breadth of the legal activities, which by and large are driven by adversarial investment or adversarial partnering opportunities within the United States. And why are we focusing on this particular adversary above and beyond the fact that they have an articulated strategy that they're executing? Well, first is the scale and sophistication of that effort and their ability to do it. And not only that, their ability to do it with consequence. So the size and strength of the economy, their near peer status as a military and economic competitor, national security competitor, all makes this conversation consequential and not just an interesting thing some nation states trying to run against us. So our CFIUS laws and other policy efforts like export control and ITAR are regulatory means by which the United States has toolkits to try to mitigate the effects of these on our society and innovation ecosystem. And that's some of what I'm going to talk about today, in addition to, basically, how are they going about this? How does this show up boots on the ground? All right, next slide, please. Yeah, so that's the focus of today's conversation. All right, next one. All right, so foreign investment as one means of this adversarial effort to acquire our technology and to manipulate our innovation ecosystem. First, the caveat. Foreign investment in the United States economy is generally beneficial and encouraged. It is the policy of the United States to encourage foreign investment within our economy. That just means more things that, more sources of capital for people who invest and make good things happen, right? But some foreign investment in the US economy gives rise to national security risks. And the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States implements a legal regulatory policy that reviews certain ones of those investments and transactions for these risks and evaluates and mitigates those risks via agreement. And pretty much this process is voluntary. This is not going to be a conversation about CFIUS and CFIUS regulatory compliance, but pretty much most of that effort is voluntary. Not all transactions and not all sources of foreign capital require review. If you are working in one of those 22 critical technologies, you likely do have to file, but please consult with your, favorite legal counsel for advice on if and when and how to do that. But the other point about CFIUS regulations that screen for national security risks from foreign investment is that that policy is reactive and not proactive. So we don't get involved from a regulatory perspective and looking at these adversarial capital risks until such time as there's already a transaction on the table and perhaps even near completion. And so all we can do is stopgap and mitigate the risk, but we are unable, or we aren't reaching early enough to prevent those risks from arising in the first place or mitigating them within our economy. And as I said before, adversarial foreign investment is one key mechanism used to acquire from US firms and venture capital funds as part of this well-architected strategy to reach into our economy and get access to innovation, technology, and know-how. Next slide, please. All right, so how exactly are they going about this? I talked about this. I said we were going to start at this high sort of strategic, theoretical level. Like, why are they doing this? Why does it matter on an international and geopolitical scale? And then we talked a little bit about, what it means to implement a strategy like that. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about, well, how exactly are they going about this inside of our borders? So one of the tools and tactics that they have is a whole series of S&T technology directorates. Now, these people are considered S&T diplomats, so they are attached to Chinese consulate and embassies, and hence they have, by and large, diplomatic immunity, although we have expelled one or two of them from time to time for charges of espionage. But they are formally a part of the government, Chinese government, and they are formally charged with implementing these strategies and policies in order to achieve those goals that we discussed about earlier. And what they do is they monitor a host country's technology development and identify partnering opportunities for those Chinese firms, which will help the Chinese obtain technologies that they need and want in order to meet that goal of becoming a superior technology country by 2049. And they play matchmaker between those officially identified targets of opportunity within a country and the Chinese firms. And they basically make a list. They basically are given a list, like a Christmas list. This is what we'd like for Christmas, please, if you can go find it within your area of your consulate, and tell us if you found it, and then make a plan for how we would approach those particular targets in order to gain access to those technologies. And so they actually have a form that they fill out, and it says things like, oh, this would be a good IP licensing play, or this would be a target of opportunity to do a JV, or this would joint venture, or this would be a target of opportunity as an investment opportunity where we could actually get them debt laid in the end and maybe get a seat on the board and start controlling what happens with this technology. So the point is there's a sequence of playbooks once they identify a particular target and decide they would like to pursue that target of opportunity. So next slide, please. All right, so I said earlier, one of our myths was, I don't have a technology of interest. I'm not playing in these fields. Perhaps if you're on this call, that's not really applicable to you. But here you can see, based on the latest data we have, which technologies have actually been targeted by these S&T diplomats within the United States economy. And you can see they range from everything from transportation technologies around railways and marine technology to bio and pharmaceuticals to agriculture to the usual telecommunications and IT suspects, as well as aerospace. So there is a huge swath of technology of interest beyond what you might think are the usual suspects. And this is how it has broken down. And perhaps you can see your own company somewhere in that pie chart of technologies. Next slide, please. All right. So, I mean, the other thing to point out is that these things are really on the rise. So this is not like a steady state thing. We are seeing an increasing number of this activity. And so this, in fact, has been increasing not only in the United States, but worldwide as these diplomats pursue their work. Next chart, please. All right, so exactly who are they targeting? And we're focusing on one vector here, but is probably the one most relevant to you all. Who exactly are they targeting for these opportunities and trying to engage with via that playbook of mechanisms I mentioned earlier? Well, the thing to note here, if we look at the partners that they target, is you would think it'd be like government labs or universities, and that is of course true, but those are only numbers 2 and 3 on the target list. Number 1 by far is private companies that exist in our economy. And you can see the other breakdown there of other sources of opportunity that are targeted on this list. And then I mentioned earlier that they have a playbook of things they try to approach companies with. And you can see that on the chart on the right-hand side, the various engagement mechanisms that they use to try to work with target companies to obtain access to technology by investing in it or creating partnerships. So we have everything from partnerships to technology transfer. There means licensing and spin-out opportunities, to cooperative manufacturing agreements, to straight up financial and equity investments, and to purchasing the product and reverse engineering, which of course is not illegal either. There are a variety of mechanisms through which we have noted the adversary approaches companies who have technology of interest within our economy. Next slide, please. All right, well, beyond CFIUS and the CFIUS regulations, which I mentioned are reactive and not proactive, what are some of the things we could be doing or might consider doing to be proactive instead of reactive and mitigate some of these risks? Well, we're doing one of them today, which is education and making these risks known and alerting people to the sophistication and targeting of these playbooks. But another thing that I'm responsible for trying to put together is an initiative called Braining for Behaviors. And the focus there is on companies with emerging tech, especially smaller companies and companies working with the DoD, but it's really open to all. And the idea is that we think of a mark like a Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval, or Malcolm Baldrig's Quality Awards or Better Business Bureau, or you get to use those marks when you have certain attributes that signal to the consumer and to the marketplace that you have those attributes, like you're a good person to do business with, you've got high quality, whatever that mark symbols in the marketplace. So the idea is that there would be a third party that the government works with that is in charge of creating that licensable mark and basically helps companies with this set of behaviors that help mitigate this risk. And by the way, those set of behaviors also propel those companies to be more likely to be successful in the long term, because frankly, a lot of them are just good corporate hygiene behaviors. And so those include things like know your investor, have an IP strategy, you've got someone in charge of export control, cybersecurity, and other basic corporate hygiene. None of this data gets supplied to the government. This is a program that'd be run by a third party, and it would not be a regulatory requirement for doing business with the DoD. So this is a program I just put labor on this past month, and we're proceeding to design that program, and we will probably pilot it here in the MAC. And if you're interested in that, please, of course, let us know. We'll probably pilot it sometime in 2024 as we roll out and try to design this initiative. All right, next slide, please. I'm trying to be mindful of my time as well. All right, so that is an opportunity, and one of the opportunities we have to mitigate this risk. I want to leave you again with this thought that we hear a lot in the press that it's Chinese theft of IP, it's misappropriation of IP through illegal means. all of those things are true and are happening with our economy. But what I want to leave you with is that there are a variety of legal means in the form of different types of adversarial investment, whether those are IP license agreement, technology transfer agreement, joint venture opportunities, and just straight up investment that are actively being pursued in a sophisticated and architected manner that has a ton of apparatus behind it to basically appropriate technologies in our society and to manipulate our innovation ecosystem in ways that aren't good for our long-term economic viability, our standard of living, and our ability to compete long-term. So that's the main point of this presentation. And next slide, I think we're at the end there. Yep. Is that other forms of acquiring technology exist, which, like I said, are illegal and have other aspects. There are other aspects of the strategy we didn't touch on today. My colleague here at the end is probably going to talk a little bit about those criminal, the more illegal aspects of the way they approach. But what I want to leave you with is that this risk, even in legal routine business transactions, exists. So if I were going to leave you with something to do and walk away from, having heard this presentation, it would be to please know your partners and please do due diligence on who your partners are. And if your partner happens to be from an adversarial nation state, then please, please, please understand that it requires a good degree of proactive mitigation on your part to reduce those risks and to manage them. And so my colleague, Bob Smith, is probably going to speak to you next about some of the other initiatives we're taking inside of DoD with some of our existing SBIR and STTR programs to help mitigate this risk. And if to the extent there's any time left available, I'm happy to take some questions. Over.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeanne. That was a very in-depth PowerPoint presentation and informational to the max, I think, for the people who are here listening and doing the innovation here in the United States and specifically here in the Pacific Northwest. Do we have any questions? I'll start off with any questions from the attendees. Feel free to write something in the chat. I know I definitely learned a few things myself. You mentioned too that we hear a lot from, maybe news outlets or, just general media about certain things, but this is a different perspective on how to actually manage and mitigate those things from a practical standpoint for your business and what that looks like from professionals like Jeanne who live in this space and study this greatly. I was actually looking through one of her papers that she co-authored, Innovation Warfare, and I found an interesting quote. I liked the quote from Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State who led to the creation of post-World War II international economic order, and he said, I saw you could not separate the idea of commerce from the idea of war and peace, and that wars were often largely caused by economic rivalry conducted unfairly. And I think that's very appropriate for Jeanne's presentation here, that there is some unfair activity that you need to be aware of and present in mind while you are creating innovative technologies in this space and supporting national security and obviously the warfighter as well. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I just want to thank you again, Jeanne, for taking time out of your day to present to these innovators and sharing your time and expertise on this matter.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, if we could go to the next slide here real quick. So without further ado, it looks like Bob Smith is already here, Director of the SBIR STTR program for the Department of the Navy. He has a presentation for you guys regarding some changes potentially coming down the pipeline regarding the due diligence program related to the SBIR opportunities that are available to innovators in this space, and hopefully you guys listening are taking advantage of the SBIRs that are available and applicable to the technologies that you guys are working on. And I don't want to hold you up any longer, so Bob, by all means, let's let's hand it over to you, and happy to have you here, and thank you for joining.
Okay, Drake, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, folks. As we get started, folks, I'm a pretty simple person. If you talk to Jeanne when we're in the room together, she will confirm I'm the most simple person in that room. But even I have come to appreciate nations have always spied on each other. Nations have always tried to have the advantage over others. Businesses have always had intellectual espionage. I mean, industrial espionage. China is the first country to apply the power of the nation to run things strategically through their business. So that's why it's scaring the US government. That's why it should bother you. Because eyes wide open. If you want China to be one of your business partners, God bless you, go for it. Whatever works for you. But understand, if you knowingly engage with China, the federal government's not going to want to work with you. And if you unknowingly work with them, it's still a problem that we're going to have to address. And part of that is going to talk about what is coming with the SBIR STTR program. I'll put up a slide in a little bit. We'll also show how it falls into the greater perspective of what the federal government is starting to implement. But the thing I want to stress about the SBIR STTR program is we're not looking to kick you out of the program. We're looking to help you understand there are risks that you need to avoid. There are risks that we will need to mitigate so we can be partners with each other. Because it really is helping you protect your intellectual property before it's stolen, locked up, and not being able to use by you to where you can become that economic powerhouse. So next slide, please. Thank you. So what did Congress say? They said, actually, they reauthorized the program on 30 September 2022 and said, at the passage of this, federal government have 270 days to develop a risk-based due diligence program to assess the security risk to SBIR participants. And there are the categories: cybersecurity practices, patents, employee analysis, and foreign ownership. They're not saying you have to have perfect cybersecurity practices. They are saying you better have some. Hell, if the Chinese can hack the Chinese ambassador, we've all got a problem. But some simple, common sense approaches to protecting your intellectual property, simple cybersecurity practices: just unplug your computer tonight, or take the hard drive out, or take it off the internet while you're not there. Patent analysis, whether or not you patented it or the Chinese have patented it. Employees, you can see that. And it talks about this is a risk base. We, the federal government, will use publicly available information. We'll use your own self-attestations to do an analysis to see if there are problems. And if we highlight those, we're going to look at what we collectively need to do to mitigate those challenges. If we can't mitigate those challenges, we're not going to make the award to you. As simple as that. Does that mean we don't want you to participate in the program? Absolutely not. Just be aware that we will be conducting this risk-based analysis, identifying challenges, working with you to mitigate those challenges so we can all protect the technology that you've created and protect the warfighters. Okay, and we do that hopefully to where you don't see any perturbation in the process of what it means for us to be doing the evaluations. It's being done concurrently with everything else. It's really done by the Navy. Shouldn't affect any timelines that go with the SBIR program. Next slide. Oh, back one. There. Why do I bring this up? Back to the chart there. We are at the forefront of an ever-growing due diligence process within the federal government. And you see the SBIR STTR program, and you can get a feel for the complexity of what we're looking at. Congress has also directed that the Director of Small Business Programs develop a due diligence process for all small businesses working with the DoD. Section 847. Boy, can't you wait till that happens. Every contract of $5 million or greater has a due diligence process that goes in place on 1 October of this year. I love the fact that Congress required that every contract at $5 million or better will go through the Section 847 due diligence process, starting with 1 October of this year. And they gave them 4 years to bring that online to full operating capability. They gave the SBIR program 270 days to get our program in place. So we, you probably haven't seen it, but we have been working our backsides off to get it in place, and it's been implemented with the 23.2/B solicitation. SCRIM, Supply Chain Risk Management. They've been doing that for years. Classified programs have had this, and we talked about CFIUS. CFIUS is reactive. SBIR, STTR, 847 will be proactive efforts. So just to understand, it's coming. It's been here, and it is here to basically thwart our adversaries that aren't playing by good open society rules. I think that's it for me, except are there any questions from anybody in the group? I know it's short and sweet, but understand it's a different world out there.
Thank you for that, Bob. Do we have any questions in the chat regarding that? We have a quiet crowd today. Well, we'll see if any further questions pop up, but thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
So I think it's super important to pay attention to some of these new programs and new processes that are going to be coming down the line for programs and funding options that certainly relate to the folks here on this call that are seeking opportunities to continually build their product out into a full-fledged and integrated system so that it can be off the shelf for the DoD. And
hey, Drayden, I will take my nickel back for a second.
Sure.
And stress for those that are participating in the program, in the SBIR STTR program, when it comes to putting in proposals and complying with solicitation instructions, is please read the instructions. We had an inordinate number of companies that were taken out of the process simply because they didn't follow the instructions. And that is disheartening. But when 88% of the companies got it right and 12% of the companies didn't read the instructions correctly, it bothers me. So please help us by following the simple new rules we have put in place.
Absolutely. I think that goes for everything that's been shared today thus far as well. Just making sure that you're paying attention to interests in your company or your product, or even your personnel that are potentially the inventors or the innovators themselves that are coming up with the very profound solutions to the problems that currently face us in modern society. So we have the FBI going to be joining us here shortly. I'm going to pass it back to Justin just for a brief moment, who is going to share kind of how DIU and their efforts integrate into this process, and additionally how they have resources available to innovators like yourselves in order to manage and mitigate some of these sometimes stressful thoughts that can percolate in the company owners' minds about influence and things like that. Those are sometimes stressful conundrums to be dealing with, and how there are resources available to you, and how do you tap into those? So I'll pass it back to Justin.
All right, thanks, Drayden. So DIU has actually built out some pretty solid capabilities for doing assessments of potential adversarial influence and capital activities. Specifically within their commercial engagement team, they have a business intelligence cell made up of some former counterintelligence individuals and with deep connections to the FBI and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And I have directed companies that I've engaged with to them several times in evaluating some outreach that those companies have received from foreign bodies about whether or not that's safe to do. But in particular, I think one of my favorite examples of this group and the work that they've done is they were working with a company that was doing some work in the hypersonics space. And that company got contacted by this real estate investment trust out of Eastern Europe, which they found to be kind of interesting that an REIT would be interested in investing in a hypersonics startup. And so the DIU Business Intelligence Group dug into this REIT and discovered that the money that was flowing into it was actually coming in from China, and they could link it back to an area of China where they concentrated their hypersonics research. And so there's basically what this is highlighting is that there's a lot of ways in which this can be sort of hidden, and it's not going to be obvious necessarily that the Chinese are actually coming to find out whether or not you have a technology that you're willing to sell to them directly. They will go through some of these circuitous routes to get to you. And so it's really important when you have that experience and, you know, the spidey senses start tingling that say there's something not quite right, to really dig into it. And so DIU can help be a resource for that. Obviously, it would become a bit of a challenge of scale if the entire country started coming to DIU to do it, but we're pretty happy to connect in and get that team to dig in to any of these kinds of occurrences that pop up. But yeah, that's really a key sort of opportunity through the MAC that you can leverage through groups like National Security Innovation Network. So we have representatives from Ensign, which is also part of DIU, and then obviously myself here in the Seattle MAC help provide that connection back to DIU as well. So with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and pause us for a minute because we've been going for almost an hour. So I think taking a quick bio break for the group would be good. And then once we come back online, we'll have the FBI present their presentation.
All right, everybody, we have the FBI folks here to go ahead and share their presentation. Thank you guys for the quick break. We just had some timing logistics, as is the reality with dealing some of these programs. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the video to Lee, and he is going to share some considerations from the perspective of the FBI related to a lot of the topics that we were discussing in our earlier presentations.
All right, you guys hear me okay? Take that as a yes, and charge ahead. My name is Lee Yates. I'm a special agent with the FBI office here in Seattle. These days, I'm our private sector coordinator. Prior to that, for the 22 years prior to that, I worked counterterrorism, both international terrorism and domestic terrorism, and counterintelligence for our office here. So all my career has been on the national security side, or what we consider the national security side. So I was asked today to come and talk with you guys a little bit about some things to keep in mind, at least from our perspective, just generally engaging in business in the world today. We're going to focus on some of our concerns with the PRC, or the government of China. And I should mention too, when I say China in this presentation, that's sort of shorthand for the government of China. It's not, I'm not referring to the population of China, or the people in China. Our main concern is the government. Certainly, if China was a democracy, I think our interaction, the world's interactions with them, would be a little different than they are today. So, next slide. There we go. So we'll start with just a baseline of why we care about China, why we think there should be some concerns about the government of China, or at least doing business in the world today, certainly in light of some of the activities that the government of China is engaged in. We'll start with this concept of military-civil fusion. And actually, even before I get into that, just along the themes of a baseline, I'd heard recently someone refer to China's plans sort of as a government regarding the rest of the world, as China doesn't want to be first in the world, they would just like to be the world. It's a little heavy-handed and maybe a little overreaching and not perfectly accurate, but it's not entirely wrong either. So a lot of the government of China's ambitions are fueled by, and even sort of centered around, their concept of having a world-class or first-class military. Certainly in light of what you've read in the newspaper or the news sites these days about China's concerns over Taiwan, the government of Taiwan, the country of Taiwan, and how closely they're watching how the world has reacted and continues to react to Russia's efforts in the war in Ukraine. They are very concerned, the government of China is very concerned about, or with getting their military to be a top-notch military, so that and their ability to do that might fuel their ambitions with South China Seas, Taiwan, and other places around the world where they are establishing a military presence these days. So this concept, this first bullet point, the military-civil fusion concept, is actually something that China has, that's a term that China uses. President Xi in China uses that. He actually sits on the Central Commission for the Military-Civil Fusion Development. So it's a term that they use. It's not a term he came up with, or a concept that he came up with, but it's certainly one that he has embraced. And it's a notion that in China, any technology that the government can acquire on the private side, or private sector side, academic side, should be used to benefit the military as well. That advancements in the private sector or academia and advancements in military technology should go hand in hand. And we'll talk about in a couple minutes about some of their legal efforts to make sure that that happens. But certainly this military-civil fusion is a driving concern, a driving effort inside China. I printed out just sort of a one-page summary from the U.S. Department of State. So their definition of military-civil fusion, just to make sure we have a clear definition, it's an aggressive national strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. And its goal is to enable the PRC to develop the most technologically advanced military in the world. It's focused on the elimination of barriers between China's civil research, or civilian research and commercial sectors, and its military and defense industrial sectors. So they're implementing the strategy not just through its own, the government's own research and development efforts, but also by acquiring and diverting the world's cutting edge technologies, including through theft, in order to achieve military dominance. So, like I mentioned, President Xi is directly involved in this particular effort. In the U.S., the president here is the commander in chief, but he often doesn't wear that hat, at least day to day. He doesn't. By contrast, in the country of China, President Xi does wear that hat. He chairs the commissions that are really involved in championing and shaping this effort. So this is something that's very personally important to him. Some other things to consider on this side are that so China wants to achieve these goals, like I mentioned, through legitimate or illicit and illicit or illegitimate means. Some of those means would be using just private investment in private industries such as yours, talent recruitment programs, directing academic and research collaboration to military gain, and then it starts to get a little more illicit on this list. So they also force technology transfer, engage in intelligence gathering with their intelligence services, and sometimes just outright theft of the information that they're interested in. So what technologies are they interested in? At least a partial list includes quantum computing, AI, big data, semiconductors, 5G, nuclear technology, aerospace technology. That list is not exhaustive, but those are certainly some of the top technologies that they as a government are very interested in obtaining to modernize their military. So the next bullet down there is the PRC national security laws. So keeping in mind that China's goals of expanding their reach around the globe, fueled by their advancing military, they have taken the trouble to pass some national security laws that will help facilitate the collection of intelligence and the advancements of those goals. So starting about 2015, they passed a national security law that required Chinese citizens and private organizations to assist the Chinese government and intelligence services with security issues whenever they're asked to. They didn't specify at the time what sorts of technology or what sorts of information or intelligence they were interested in, but it was whatever the government had determined was important or of some sort of value. Chinese citizens were compelled, starting in 2015, to provide that information, and Chinese citizens and businesses as well. So along the line since then, they passed a couple cybersecurity laws, national intelligence laws, and 2021, they passed an anti-foreign sanctions law, which is interesting, especially for those engaging in business that touches the government of China or certainly the country of China. And that law provides the grounds for the PRC government to take countermeasures against foreign sanctions and authorizes PRC actions against foreign persons or entities that implement or assist foreign sanctions against China. So if you think about things like the entities list, where U.S. government or U.S. companies and persons are not allowed to sell certain types of equipment to certain entities in China or even around the world. If you are participating in those sanctions and you have some sort of physical presence in China, you could be in violation of this Chinese law while you're trying to comply with the U.S. law, which puts companies potentially in a very, very rough position. And you could be criminally liable inside China for complying with U.S. sanctions against China. So that's something to be aware of as you're navigating the current landscape. In 2023, so this year, China updated that national security law with a counter-espionage law, and it really just expanded upon that original 2015 law. And expanded the definition of espionage from covering not only just state secrets and intelligence, but now also any documents, data, materials, or items relating to national security interests without any definition of what that information could be. So it really expanded the concept of that law and can compel not just Chinese persons and Chinese companies, but also other people doing business in China to assist or provide information to the PRC government, intelligence services, military, et cetera. So that really opens the door to pretty much anything that the government of China wants that the government of China can get. Probably worth noting too that certainly folks, the intelligence services can show up at someone's door inside China, knock on the door and say, hey, tell me what you're working on, or give me the information that you have at your disposal. They can also just flip a switch in some cases and obtain that information without having to command someone to give it to them, just because their access to information inside China is so robust. So there's some things to keep in mind when doing business inside China, and things to keep in mind when doing business here with entities that are inside China and covered by those laws when they go home or when they're talking to you online. The last topic here is malign foreign influence. I'll touch on this just fairly briefly. So foreign influence is something that every government engages in, just advancing their own interests. All governments do it. And it's, you can agree or disagree with the interests of that particular government, but if it's above board and it's coming from the government, that's just sort of normal foreign influence. Malign foreign influence is when those activities are not openly affiliated with the government that's engaging in them. So sometimes this is a person in China or a government entity in China or diplomatic entity in China reaching out to a third party, asking them to champion one of China's goals as if they were that third party's goals sort of personally held. So this sometimes plays out. One sort of random example I can think of is there's a pretty good zoo in Nebraska. They were very interested in expanding their zoo and getting a panda, and Chinese diplomats were reaching out to the organizers of that zoo saying, we've got some pandas, we're happy to send you some pandas, but it'd be really great as we're considering whether or not to send you these pandas, if you could go ahead and speak out on behalf of how Taiwan really is the property of China. And in the end, the zoo didn't get the pandas, they didn't speak out on behalf of China. But that's just one sort of example of the government sort of applying its influence through a third party. So certainly as you advance in your careers and your businesses grow and you develop government contracts or military contracts here in the US, you would have access to entities that the Chinese government would really like to exploit. So keep in mind, as your businesses grow and as they mature, just be mindful for requests from third parties or even directly asking for these sorts of favors or suggesting that you help them out with these sorts of favors. Just something to keep in mind. All right, next slide. So a couple of resources that are available. In addition to just arming yourself and being aware, there's some reference material that's available out there, just open source, that could help as your businesses grow, to protect you, to make sure that you are engaging with folks that you're legally allowed to engage with, and also people that are sort of it's wise to engage with, or avoiding the ones that it's wise to avoid. So this first list, and there's a link to it. I think that will be made available. They can use this going forward. But the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, publishes a military end user list, and there's a link to it. And they update it fairly frequently. I think the most recent one was updated in 2022. But it's just a list of known parties that are determined by the U.S. government to be military end users. And it's a pretty handy list. It is there. If you look it up and follow that link, you will see that there are spaces available for countries like Burma, Cambodia, Venezuela. All those are empty. The People's Republic of China list is pretty thorough, and actually the only country that's actually covered on this particular list. But it includes not just the companies themselves, but also some of their subsidiaries. So, for example, the Aero Engine Company of China this lists several of their subsidiaries. So you know that you're avoiding not just the parent company, but also some of their subsidiaries. Same with AVIC and other companies on down the line. So it's a good thing to keep handy as you are starting to get either requests for investment from foreign entities possibly, or certainly looking for partners to grow your business. And then that next list down, the Department of Defense, in an act that was that National Defense Authorization Act that was actually passed in 1999, DoD was compelled at the time to provide a list of known communist Chinese military companies that were operating directly or indirectly in the US. They didn't actually publish that list or get around to publishing that list until 2020. And since then, they've made a couple of updates. So if you go to that link, I think the first link that comes up will be to the most recent list, and you can kind of dial back on some of the previous iterations of that list. And it looks like they don't reconstruct the list every time. They just sort of provide updates. So it's important to follow each of those links. And that list includes some of the same companies that were mentioned in that first bullet point, the BIS list, but also some others. So a couple of the surprising ones on here I thought were Hikvision is listed on here, Huawei, which isn't too surprising, just because they've been in the news a fair amount over the last few years, but it also includes some fairly obvious ones like China National Nuclear Corp, China Telecom, and on and on. So it's not a huge list, but it is a pretty decent reference list. And unlike the military end user list, I think there's no compulsion to avoid dealing with these particular companies, at least on their own, at least for this NDAA list. It's just for your information, probably not in your best interest to interact with a company that is ultimately owned by or closely affiliated with the Chinese military. All right, next slide. And then the FBI has some resources as well. So most of these are like brochures, or there's at least one video in this list that are just good for reference, good for sort of short bullet point type things to keep in mind on hosting visitors, traveling yourself, some more concerns about intellectual property protection, things like that. So I won't, in the interest of time, dial into each one of those. I will highlight a couple. The second to the last one on there is it mentions the Never Night connection, which is actually a video that the FBI produced. It's not bad for a government produced video. I think it runs about a half hour, maybe. It's, production wise, it's probably on par with a Hallmark Hollywood movie or a Christmas movie, less romantic. But it's not bad for a government video. It's not bad. And it's a fictionalized account of a true story of a guy who was recruited through social media and kind of went down a path helping the Chinese government, I think first unwittingly and ultimately wittingly. So it's a good cautionary tale, and it's a good 20-30 minutes of your life. The following, the link just after that is something called Think Before You Link. That's not what the link actually spells out, but that's what it is when you follow that link. It'll say Think Before You Link, which strangely enough is a campaign that the UK put out. I think the UK's version of Homeland Security put this out, and rather than recreating the wheel, we just provided a link to a UK government website. And on there you can find brochures, some more videos. These are British videos. I haven't actually seen the British videos, but if only because they have British accents, they're going to be classier than anything the Bureau's produced. And you'll also see that words are spelled strangely because it's British English and not American English. So center has an RE and realize is with an S. But it has some good things to keep in mind. And when you're interacting with folks online, especially through social media, things like LinkedIn, this may not be surprising to you, but not everyone is who they seem when they're on the internet. Just because they don't say that they're located in China or Russia doesn't mean that they're not. And so that campaign in particular has some things to keep in mind. And as your companies grow, also some resources for helping educate your own workforce on how to sort of stay smart in how you're interacting with folks on the internet. And it's not just applicable to Chinese counterintelligence services, which certainly do exploit social media. Other counterintelligence services do the same, as do criminals. So it just sort of generally has some good suggestions for keeping yourself safe and on the internet, interacting through social media. And then lastly, the FBI is a resource. We in Seattle, our office is just literally a block or so away from the MAC here in Seattle, and we are honestly here to help. You'll have me as a resource. You can contact me. I'm a private sector coordinator, which means that I'm a conduit between our office and the private sector. So please use me. If I don't have the answer readily, it's my job to try and find it for you. So so please do that. And I think that's it. Last slide is just for questions.
All right, do we have any questions from the chat here for Lee? All right, without seeing any questions, I'll go ahead and take over here to close us out. Just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully you learned a handful of things from the variety of presenters. I know we touched on a lot of heavy subjects and things that maybe you aren't quite as familiar with or recognize in your direct activities on a regular basis. But these are informational pieces that are necessary to protect your company, to protect your innovation, to protect your intellectual property, and so on and so forth. I know this was originally scheduled to go till 2 o'clock, so I'm going to give you back an hour of your day, and I don't think anybody will hate me for that. But if you do have further questions or things come up along the course of your guys' business, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can get you in contact with the appropriate individuals that have the answer to your questions. We'll move on to the next slide here. There's some final housekeeping here from the Pacific Northwest Mission Acceleration Center as well. So this was, again, the third iteration of our Business of Innovation in Defense seminar series. If you missed out on the first two, they will be uploaded to our website for your viewing pleasure. And you guys can take a look at the other topics that we covered. We started out with an intro to doing business with the DoD and had a couple of companies who have successfully secured multi-million-dollar contracts talk about their process and what it took for them to get to that stage. So that was a great opener for this series. Our second seminar series that was a couple of weeks ago, we talked about accounting for federal contracts and the DoD and how to appropriately manage commercialization and the resources that are available therein. So today's seminar was related to adversarial capital and influence and how to pay attention to compliance and the regulatory environments therein. And upcoming on August 23rd, we will be discussing specialized funding options as well as specifics related to contracting with the DoD. We will have some folks from the National Security Innovation Network's Transition Cell who works with companies to take your business from a phase 1 SBIR to a phase 3 SBIR, as well as creating opportunities for you to have other transactional authorities, contract opportunities. And so they will share their wealth of knowledge related to these processes and how best to position your company to find funding options within the DoD as long as your technology is appropriately aligned with the current offerings that funding options that are available. So with that, next slide. And that's it. My email information is here at the bottom. I thank you all again for joining. We're going to close the seminar again about a little early for you guys and let you have a little bit back of your day, maybe to digest some of the information that you guys received. As always, the information will be available. If you guys want the slides directly, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll have those links available that were discussed by Lee as well. And the video itself will be uploaded here, hopefully by the end of the week. So thank you again, and hope to see you guys next time.